One important and arguably neglected theme in Holocaust research has to do with resistance. It's surprising how many people honestly imagine that the Jews were somehow passive during this collective nightmare, that they went like proverbial sheep to the slaughter. But resistance there was, and it was spearheaded by certain groups that we might not immediately associate with resistance: the Jewish youth movements of Central Europe. In point of fact, Jewish youth movements were at the forefront of active resistance during the entire Holocaust era. The map of Eastern Europe is dotted with Jewish armed resistance in ghettos and in camps from 1941 to 1944. It was a heroic struggle on every level. But just as Jews in the general communities were divided along political lines from left to right, so were the Jewish youth and youth groups. Just before World War II broke out, in the fall of 1939, some 100,000 young Jews were involved in the various youth movements. Despite the fact that the Nazis outlawed Jewish youth movements and their activities early on, the movements continued in secret. Some young Jews were doctrinaire communists. Some were Trotskyites. Some were Zionists. Some were members of the Socialist Bund. Among the first youth movements in Eastern Europe was Shomer HaTzair, which combined both Zionism and radical socialism in its ideology. The Dror movement was similar to HaShomer HaTzair, but its members came from poorer circles. Here's a pamphlet produced by Dror in 1943, depicting resistance fighters in the midst of the flames of the Holocaust. The Gordonia movement promoted a more moderate Zionist socialist platform, while the Noar HaTzioni and Akiva youth movements encouraged Zionism and Hebrew culture. Moving to the right wing of the political spectrum, there was a Zionist group called Beitar, named after the last stand of the anti-Roman freedom fighters of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Here's a Beitar rally in 1933. Many of the Zionist movements, except Beitar, were connected to specific kibbutz, or collective settlement movements in Palestine, and part of their ideological base involved sending members to settle in Palestine. Many of them participated in agricultural training programs in preparation for their relocation. The connection between the members of these movements was strong, and so was their belief that they were preparing for something of great importance. This attitude was probably one of the reasons that youth movement members, despite their age, took a leading role in resisting the Nazis. After Germany invaded Poland, signaling the beginning of the war, many youth movement leaders fled the cities of Western and Central Poland for Soviet-held Eastern Poland and still neutral Lithuanian Vilna, hoping to make it from there onto Palestine. But it wasn't long before some of the youth movements decided to send a number of their senior members back to German-occupied territory to help their fellow young people trapped by the Nazis and reorganize them for a viable existence as secret underground organizations. Of course, they didn't know and couldn't know that Adolf Hitler planned murder for all of them. Among the leaders who returned home in 1940 were Yitzhak or Antek Zuckerman of the Dror HeChalutz movement and Mordechai Anilevich of the Hashomer Hatzair movement. There were others who remained in Lithuanian Vilna, and some managed to flee to the USSR. But many who escaped later suffered from a curious psychological malady: survivor's guilt. As for those back in Poland, there were two things that united them. Most importantly, they had a Zionist ideological base. They were a dispersed people who had to remain together, and the leaders needed to remain with their followers. Underground papers were circulated, and there were many discussions about Palestine, Marxism, and so on. Over time, the only thing left to unite them was a sense of solidarity among those who had survived. And that gave them the psychological support system that they needed to overcome all kinds of hardship. The other aspect of their unity involves a psychological base. The group became their family, which was all the more important since many members of their own families had by now disappeared. It was then that the concept of resistance was born. After all, you don't fight the strongest army in Europe unless you well know that you're going to be killed anyway. By now, they just wanted to register a moral protest, a great national statement, leading eventually to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And once they realized what was really happening all around them, once they got the big picture regarding the extermination of the Jews of Europe, their resistance stiffened all the more. The youth movements in the ghettos of Poland embarked upon various activities, such as organizing study courses, seminars, and ideological workshops. They were also in charge of publishing underground newspapers, and in Warsaw, the youth movements set up a courier network to keep in contact with other ghettos. In Warsaw, Vilna, and other locales, youth movements established militias to carry out uprisings within those ghettos. In other ghettos, such as in Kovno, the young resistors made plans to escape to the forests and join the partisans. One of the first and clearest calls for resistance came from a young man by the name of Abba Kovner. He would later become a poet, novelist, military commander, and decades later, the driving force behind the creation of Israel's Diaspora Museum, a permanent exhibition showcasing the life of the Jewish people across their many centuries of dispersion and wandering. His story is one of the most compelling to come out of the Holocaust. In June 1941, Nazi Germany attacked Vilna, which was by that time in Lithuanian SSR, and after occupation established the Vilna ghetto. I managed to escape with several friends from the Shomer Hatzair youth to a Dominican convent headed by Anna Barkowska in the city suburbs. The nuns told us what was going on, how the Nazis were killing Jews. And from that, I deduced that the Nazis were determined to kill every last Jew in Europe. I wrote, "It is still difficult for me to explain why Vilna is hemorrhaging blood while Bialystok is calm. One thing is clear to me. Vilna is not just Vilna. Ponar is not just an episode. It is a whole system." There wasn't anything particularly logical about it, but it was true. And I had figured it out. I returned to the ghetto. I concluded that in order for any revolt to succeed, a Jewish fighting force was needed. And so I decided to form an underground. We often used girls as couriers because they would not be suspected. We made alliances with the Bund and the Young Communists. With the help of a group of nuns and the Marxist youth movement, we received weapons. On July 28, 1942, we undertook our first real resistance at a small eastern Polish town where there had been an action, an action by the Germans against the Jews. Many of us Jews fled to the forest. We seized guns from dead Soviet soldiers. Of course, many of us were killed in the process. But we did what we had to do. There was no turning back. Unbeknownst to them, there was a completely parallel yet isolated resistance movement forming in Western Europe. In May 1942, there was a meeting in southern France of a number of leaders of the underground Zionist movement. They decided to form an organized resistance. By then, they knew about the Nazi plan of genocide, and they aimed to hide as many Jews as possible, especially children, or perhaps get them across the border to Spain. Many of them had roots in the Communist Party of France and also in the Movement of Organizations of Immigrants, or MOI. But the core of the movement was Jewish. They heroically fought the Germans, and they suffered serious casualties. But they also managed to save between 7,000 and 9,000 children in occupied France. Interestingly enough, none of them were betrayed by the French. Back in Hungary, the Zionist movement wasn't large. They also recognized that the wisest course was not to resist with arms, since combating the power of the German army was useless. Zionist youth groups supplied food to ghettos, stole money. They appeared in fascist military uniforms and engaged in many daring exploits, including the rescue of many Jewish children. They also created thousands of false identification papers for Jews. Their story dovetails with celebrated Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who was stationed in Budapest. While serving as Sweden's special envoy in 1944, he issued protective passports and sheltered Jews in safe houses, which were designated as Swedish territory, saving tens of thousands of lives. On January 17, 1945, during the siege of Budapest by the Red Army, Wallenberg was detained by Soviet authorities on suspicion of espionage and subsequently disappeared. He was later reported to have died in July 1947 while imprisoned by communist authorities and KGB secret police. But Abba Kovner, for his part, was subsequently consumed with guilt. He remarked, "I don't know whether I should be remembered as a fighter of Germans or a betrayer of my mother, who could not escape with me as I went off to fight with the underground." There were, of course, many dilemmas faced by all. But the bottom line is, we need to study how victims react in situations of genocide. And that's a universal theme, not just a Jewish issue. Kovner would later say this in a speech before the Jewish Brigade in Italy in 1945. "But what are we to do in our sick souls? We bear not only the vision of the past, but also that of the future. And we feel with all our senses the breath of the approaching slaughtering knife. The knife which lies in ambush in every corner, on every path and highway of Europe. The new knife was born on the fields of Majdanek, Ponar, and Treblinka, where millions of the masses of tens of nations saw how it was done. So easily, so simply, and so quietly.
Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unsere Mut. Es wird die Morgensonn begilden uns dem Heind. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind.